What if the world you know disappeared in an instant, buried under an impenetrable blanket of snow? Before us is a family of pioneers on the Great Plains, trapped in a tiny sod house. Outside, a blizzard rages, the temperature has dropped to unimaginable levels, and the last armful of firewood has just turned to ash. The fire, the center of their universe, has gone out. They have no coal, no wood, and the nearest neighbor is dozens of miles away across an icy desert. It is a scenario of utter despair, where survival seems impossible. However, they survived using methods that seem incredible today. Watch the video to the end to learn how people in the Wild West defied icy death when their main source of life, fire, betrayed them. I will reveal the pioneers' best-kept secret, what they feared most. It was not hunger or hostile raids, but the first winter blizzard. For settlers arriving from wooded states like Ohio or Pennsylvania, the Great Plains came as a real shock. Instead of endless supplies of oak and pine, they saw an ocean of grass where trees were a rare treasure. The first task was not to build a house, but to provide it with fuel. Families deliberately settled as close to rivers as possible. Only in the floodplains of rivers could willow, poplar, and other sparse tree species be found. These small groves became a source of life. Gathering firewood was hard work that took months. People went on expeditions lasting several days to chop and bring back this precious resource. Each log was worth its weight in gold, and its consumption was strictly controlled. Even the largest supply of firewood seemed insignificant in the face of winter on the plains. Blizzards could last for weeks, cutting families off from the world. The frost was so severe that a standard stove would consume a day's worth of firewood in just a couple of hours. Often, the settlers simply miscalculated their needs. They could not imagine the intensity of the cold and wind in these latitudes. Accustomed to mild winters, they were unprepared for the harsh reality of the frontier. When the firewood was running out, the first stage of despair began. Anything that could burn but was not yet considered critically important was thrown into the fire. Old boxes, broken tools, leftover building materials. All this only delayed the inevitable for a short time. The situation was exacerbated by the construction of the first dwellings. Early log cabins were full of cracks, and precious heat escaped instantly. Keeping a fire going in such a house was like trying to fill a leaky bucket with water. That is why sod houses, or soddies, became so popular. They were built from layers of earth and required almost no wood. But this also meant that settlers did not even have a spare plank to throw in the fire. The fear of running out of fuel was a constant companion in frontier life. It dictated where to build a house, how to plan for summer, and what to pray for in winter. This fear gave rise to incredible ingenuity, which became the key to survival. The realization that traditional methods did not work came quickly and brutally. Families had to improvise using whatever was literally at their feet. We are very interested in hearing your point of view. What do you think about how such a shortage of basic resources shaped the character of the pioneers? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about what really burned in the stoves of the Wild West? When firewood ran out, grass became the first and most obvious substitute. The endless prairies, which were a curse when it came to finding firewood, became a salvation. But dry grass burned instantly, giving off almost no heat. Simply throwing it into the stove was pointless. Settlers quickly developed the technology of hay bundles, or grass sticks. Dry hay or pressed grass was tightly twisted into dense bundles, resembling logs. It was monotonous and laborious work that the household members did for hours. The tighter the bundle was twisted, the longer and hotter it burned. This method required constant attention. Grass burned much faster than wood, and someone had to sit by the stove, constantly throwing in new bundles. This turned maintaining the fire into a continuous watch. Special devices were required for the effective burning of grass. Standard stoves were often unsuitable. Craftsmen modified the fireboxes, adding special grates to ensure airflow and prevent the ashes from extinguishing the flame. Some even built stoves specifically for burning hay. These were large structures that could be loaded with a large volume of twisted grass at once. Such a stove could maintain heat for several hours. Another important source of fuel was corn. Settlers on the plains grew it in huge quantities. The cobs themselves were used for food, but the dry husk remained as a byproduct. Corn cobs turned out to be surprisingly good fuel. They were dense, dry, and produced a strong, even heat. Families collected and stored cobs throughout the summer and fall, creating a supply for the winter. They burned very quickly and left a huge amount of light white ash. The stoves had to be cleaned several times a day, but the heat they gave off was comparable to good firewood. The use of grass and stubble was not just improvisation, but standard practice. In many areas, it was the main fuel for decades. It was survival economics in its purest form. But what if I told you that the most effective solution was not what to burn, but how the house itself was built? Read on to the next chapter to learn about the ingenious heating technology of turf houses. What you've never seen before: how a house built of dirt became the warmest shelter. We tend to think of pioneer homes as cold and drafty huts, but the sod house, or soddy, was a true marvel of engineering, perfectly adapted to the harsh climate. The secret was in the material. The walls of a sod house were made of large, thick layers of sod cut directly from the prairie. These layers, with grass roots, were tightly packed together to form a monolithic structure. The walls could be up to half a meter thick, and sometimes even more. This created an incredible thermal inertia effect. The massive earthen wall accumulated heat and released it very slowly. In summer, such a house was cool, even in the most intense heat. In winter, it worked like a thermos. Even if the fire in the stove went out, the temperature inside the soddy dropped very slowly, rarely falling below freezing. Earth itself is an excellent insulator. In essence, the settlers lived inside an earthen hut, only brought to the surface. This ensured passive survival. Even more effective were dugouts, or semi-dugouts. These dwellings were often dug directly into the slope of a hill or ravine. One or more walls were completely protected by a layer of earth. In such a shelter, the temperature was even more stable. The heat of the earth, which has a constant temperature, warmed the dwelling from within. It was uncomfortable and damp, but it guaranteed survival. Even the roofs of the sod houses worked to conserve heat. They were covered with a layer of turf, which served as additional insulation. Of course, they often leaked, but in terms of heat, it was an effective solution. The settlers quickly realized this advantage. While their neighbors in log cabins desperately fought drafts and burned tons of firewood, the inhabitants of sod houses could survive several days of blizzards with minimal heating. Thus, the choice of dwelling itself was already a survival strategy. It allowed them to stretch their meager fuel supplies for as long as possible. It was the first line of defense against the cold, and it was built right into the walls. If you like learning about such unconventional ingenuity, please like this video. What if I showed you a time machine so you could see how settlers turned their homes into real bunkers? Even the best sod house needed extra preparation for winter. When the blizzard approached, the active phase of insulation began, turning the house into an airtight capsule. The key technology was hilling, or banking the house. This meant that on the outside, around the entire perimeter, a high layer of earth, turf, or straw was piled up against the walls. This additional insulating layer blocked the wind at the base of the house. When snow fell, it became the settlers' best ally. They deliberately raked huge snowdrifts against the walls, sometimes covering the house with snow up to the roof. Snow, as we know, is an excellent heat insulator. This snow armor completely blocked the icy wind. A house buried in a snowdrift lost heat much more slowly. The main thing was not to forget to leave the chimney open and ensure airflow. But the main battle with the cold was inside. The weakest points were the windows and doors. They were caulked with any available materials: moss, rags, old paper. Cracks in the walls and floor, which were normal in summer, became a deadly threat in winter. Every draft was an enemy that had to be found and destroyed. The household spent days filling every tiny crack. But even that was not enough. The most ingenious solution was to create a microclimate inside the house. Instead of trying to heat the entire room, they reduced the living space. Using blankets, animal skins, or old carpets, the large room was divided into sections. Often, the whole family would move into one small area, usually around the stove. This tent inside the house was much easier to heat. Sometimes a blanket was hung over the dining table, creating a kind of tent. The heat from the food and people accumulated under this improvised dome. These were desperate but effective measures. The entire life of the family was compressed into a few square meters. It was psychologically difficult, but it allowed them to survive. They sacrificed comfort for the sake of preserving precious degrees of heat. How strong do you think family relationships had to be to withstand such a test? In the next chapter, we will talk about the most controversial and unexpected fuel that saved thousands of lives, but which was not considered acceptable to discuss in polite society. When the supplies of grass and brushwood ran out, the settlers had one last but most reliable source of fuel. It was scattered in abundance across the Great Plains. We are talking about cow dung, or as it was called in the Wild West, chips. It was the dried dung of the huge herds that roamed freely across the prairies. For settlers accustomed to firewood, the idea of using this material as fuel was initially repulsive. However, necessity quickly overcame disgust. Soon, cow dung became the main fuel of the plains. Collecting it was as important a part of summer and autumn work as harvesting crops. The whole family was involved, roaming the prairie with sacks and carts. The collected patties were brought home and neatly stacked in tall piles, just like firewood. These stacks were a vital supply. Their size determined whether the family would survive the winter. The fuel was free, but collecting it required a lot of work. In addition, there was competition for it. As the prairies became more populated, this resource also became scarce. Dried dung was surprisingly effective as fuel. It burned slowly and gave off an even, strong heat. It did not flare up like grass and smoldered for hours, keeping the house warm. Of course, there was a downside, the smell. Although completely dried dung had almost no smell when stored, when burned it emitted a specific acrid smoke. This smell permeated everything: clothes, hair, food. The settlers joked that the smell of smoke from the chimney could tell you how long a family had been living on the plains. If the smoke smelled like willow, they were newcomers. If it smelled like chips, they were true veterans of the frontier. Later, when the herds of wild animals disappeared, they were replaced by the droppings of domestic herds. Cow chips became just as valuable a commodity. This fuel was literally lying underfoot, and it alone made life in treeless areas possible. Without this resource, vast areas of the Great Plains would have remained uninhabited. It was dirty, unpleasant work, but it was the price of survival. People did what they had to do to see the next spring. A secret passed down from generation to generation in all cold countries. What to do when there is no fuel? The answer is simple. Become the fuel yourself. When all sources of fire ran out, the family had one last heat resource left: their own bodies. This was a survival strategy known as retreating to bed. The whole family, fully clothed, would gather under all the available blankets, sheepskin coats, and rugs. They would lie close together to maximize the overall warmth. They could spend several days in this position, waiting for the blizzard to end. The only goal was to conserve heat. Any movement was limited as it led to heat loss. It was unbearably boring and psychologically difficult, but it worked. The layer of blankets retained heat, and their bodies huddled together generated it. It was the human equivalent of a den. Clothing was key to this strategy. The settlers wore several layers: woolen underwear, flannel shirts, sweaters, vests. Everything was worn at once. Only wet outer clothing was removed. The feet were the most vulnerable spot. They were wrapped in several pairs of woolen socks. Sometimes heated stones were taken to bed if it was possible to light a fire, even for a short time. These stones, wrapped in cloth, served as hot water bottles. They slowly gave off heat, helping them to warm up and fall asleep. Sometimes bricks were used for this purpose, as they also retained heat for a long time. Food was prepared, if possible, once a day, or they made do with dry rations, dried meat, crackers, cold beans. The main thing was not to waste energy on digestion. At these moments, the house ceased to be a dwelling and became a simple shelter from the wind. Life came to a standstill. People fell into a kind of suspended animation, saving every calorie, every fraction of a degree. It was a race of endurance. Could they hold out longer than the storm? Their only task was to survive until they could go outside again. What do you think was more difficult in such a situation? Fighting the cold or the despair of inaction? In the next chapter, we will learn how the diet changed when it became impossible to cook food. When the stove cooled down, not only did the temperature in the house change, but so did the entire food system. Cooking itself required a huge amount of fuel. Therefore, in a crisis situation, families switched to a diet that did not require heat treatment. This was only possible thanks to foresight. Throughout the summer and fall, housewives were busy preserving and preparing food. They salted meat, dried fruits and vegetables, and prepared supplies for the winter. The basis of the cold diet was dried or salted meat. It was high in calories and did not require fire. It could be chewed dry or, at best, soaked in cold water. Crackers and biscuits were another lifesaver. This was bread dried to a rock-hard state. It could be stored for months without spoiling and served as a source of carbohydrates. If there was a little flour left in the house, it was used to make the simplest dough. Mixing flour with water and salt produced dense flatbread. They were eaten raw, as there was no fuel for baking. Cans of canned vegetables or beans were opened and eaten straight away. It was tasteless but nutritious. The main task was to get enough calories so that the body could warm itself. Fats played a key role. Salted lard or smalts were essential products. Fat is concentrated energy. A small piece of lard gave strength for several hours. Water became a problem. Frozen water in barrels was useless. Buckets of snow had to be brought into the house and left to melt from the warmth of the room and bodies. It was a survival diet, devoid of any pleasure. Eating turned from a ritual into a simple replenishment of energy reserves. But that was what allowed people to hold out. Sometimes, if they managed to build a small fire from a bundle of grass, they would prepare a hot drink on it. It could be weak tea or just hot water. A sip of warmth had enormous psychological significance, restoring the will to live. One of the most unexpected and dangerous problems was the ice that formed inside the dwelling. When the fire went out, the temperature in the house dropped to freezing point, but people continued to breathe. Moisture from the breath of dozens of people, as well as from cooking, if it was done, condensed on the cold walls. In turf houses with earthen walls, this was not so noticeable, but in log cabins, it turned into a disaster. The walls, windows, and even the ceiling were covered with a thick layer of frost. It was not just hoarfrost, but a real ice crust. It grew every day, turning the house into an ice cave. This ice was not just an inconvenience, it was a sign of enormous heat loss. Every frozen drop meant that precious heat was escaping from the house. The frost on the walls made life unbearable. It was impossible to lean against the walls. Clothes left nearby froze to them. The bed, pushed up against the wall, became wet and icy. Any metal surface, such as a door handle or utensils, became dangerously cold. Touching it with a wet hand could lead to instant frostbite. Fighting this internal ice was pointless until there was a fire. Scraping it off was useless. It would just grow back. The only solution was to light the stove. When the blizzard subsided and fuel could be obtained, the thaw began. The ice on the walls melted and water began to drip from the ceiling and walls. The house turned into a swamp. Water poured onto the beds and into the food. All the clothes became wet. This period was no less difficult than the frost itself, but it meant victory. It meant that the house was warm again. After that, it took several days to dry all the belongings before life returned to normal. This cycle of freezing and thawing was exhausting. It destroyed the house, ruined belongings, and undermined health. But it was an integral part of winter on the frontier. When all the chips were burned, when the stumps and grass were gone, the moment of truth arrived. The family faced the most difficult choice. Their eyes fell on the only thing left to burn, their own belongings. The first things to go into the fire were those of least value. Broken boxes, old barrels, useless scraps of wood. This gave them a short respite, but did not solve the problem. Then it was the fence's turn. The fence, which had been so painstakingly built to protect the garden and livestock, was dismantled board by board. These tarred boards, dried in the sun, burned well. It was a desperate decision. Dismantling the fence meant that all the work would have to be redone in the spring. It was like burning bridges to the future. When the fence was finished, attention turned to the barn and other farm buildings. People began to dismantle them, board by board. Survival here and now was more important than preserving the buildings. The last and most tragic step was burning the furniture. Chairs, tables, and cabinets, made by hand or brought from the east with great difficulty, all went into the furnace. This was not just the destruction of property, it was the destruction of memory. Each item was connected to a past, normal life. By throwing it into the fire, people were saying goodbye to a part of themselves. There is evidence that people went so far as to dismantle the wooden floors in their homes. They tore up the boards, leaving only the earthen floor, just to keep the fire burning for a few more hours. In the most extreme cases, even tool handles and gun stocks were used. Anything made of wood became potential fuel. It was a Pyrrhic victory. The family survived, but by spring they could be left in an empty house without tools or furniture. The price of warmth was incredibly high. This act of desperation demonstrates how thin the line between civilization and survival was. In the fight against the cold, all the achievements of a previous life could go up in smoke overnight.
Thank you. This means so much to us.
The struggle against the cold was not always a story of loneliness. In settlements where families lived relatively close together, social factors came to the rescue. When one family ran out of fuel, they were not always doomed. Often neighbors would come to their aid. Those who had more supplies would share with those in need. It was an unwritten law of the frontier. Today you help, tomorrow you will be helped. In particularly harsh winters or prolonged blizzards, families resorted to consolidation. Several families could temporarily move into one, the warmest and strongest house. It was a logical solution. They pooled their meager supplies of fuel, food, and bedding. Instead of trying to heat 3 or 4 houses, they heated one. The warmth of 20 bodies was already a significant resource. Such communal living was uncomfortable and deprived of personal space. But it was effective. It allowed people to survive, supporting each other not only with warmth, but also morally. However, the outcome was not always happy. The history of the Wild West is full of stories of settlers who did not survive their first winter. Some were simply not prepared for such an ordeal. Sometimes, realizing that they would not survive the winter, families made a desperate decision. They abandoned everything, their homes, their possessions, their crops. They hitched up their wagons and tried to return east to civilization. It was an escape, but sometimes it was their only chance. It was better to lose everything but save their lives than to remain in an icy trap. Those who stayed and survived underwent the most brutal selection process. They learned from their mistakes. The following summer, they stocked up on twice as much fuel, insulated their homes better, and were prepared for the worst. Winter on the plains was the ultimate test. It weeded out the weak and unprepared. But those who passed proved their right to live on this harsh but generous land. We see that survival on the frontier was not just an adventure, but a daily exhausting struggle. When the fire went out, the settlers did not give up. They responded to the challenge of the cold with incredible ingenuity, using grass, earth, snow, and even the heat of their own bodies. These methods show us people who were pushed to their limits, but not broken. They turned their homes into thermoses, ate cold food, and burned their own furniture to survive until morning. This is a story of resilience, adaptation, and an enormous will to live. Which of these forgotten survival skills do you think could be useful in the modern world? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new stories about frontier exploration.
The symbol of the settlers' resilience and their ability